Hi, my name is Deana Rohlinger. I am the Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Community Engagement in the College of Social Sciences at Florida State University. I'm so pleased today to be with Dr. Katrinell Davis, who is here to discuss with us her book that just came out on Monday titled Tainted Tap and about her new podcast. Welcome, Dr. Davis. Thanks so much for joining us today, Katrinell. I really do appreciate you taking time to tell us about your new book.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. This is an honor and a privilege to share the work and to keep people, again, talking about Flint and the crisis. Just really happy to be here.
Yeah, well, just tell us a little bit about how you became interested in the crisis in Flint.
Well, I became interested in the crisis in Flint when a relative called me. First, I should say that I was born and raised in Flint. And so a relative living in Flint called me and said, essentially, the water's jacked up, right? And this is before anyone saying anything about it on the news. No one's reporting on it, but people were really struggling with the water. The aesthetic quality, or the water was brown. It stunk. It was making people sick, right? At the same time, I should also let you know that I was already in the process of looking at Flint. I'm a social change scholar, and way back when I began looking at collective efficacy and what communities can do to change their circumstances. Oftentimes, we assume that communities like those broken windows. they like stores that charge a lot for spoiled items, right? And the fact of the matter is, people don't. And for generations, or rather decades, folks have made attempts to address those concerns in their communities. I don't think that we've done a lot to make sense of what they encounter. And so really since 2011, I've been looking at Flint. Really after I finished my first study, or the first book that I wrote, Hard Work is Not Enough. I was in a space where I was like, well, now I'm in a position to do my dream study. And I can tell you, I've been a nerd forever. So let's put that on the table. And so, yeah, I was the captain of the quiz bowl team, all of that good stuff, right?
We're academics, we're all nerds here.
Okay. But I remember writing papers in high school about Flint and its history. I remember being a member of the mayor's youth cabinet. I remember what it meant to be the first recipient of the Frank J. Manley Scholarship, of the James Gransberry Scholarship. Those things were meaningful to me because really and truly, had I not had those scholarships, I would have had a really tough time getting through college. I had very little support. And so Flint has always been on my radar. The moment I was able to dedicate concentrated time to understanding, again, the problems people face, particularly in this case, with just trying to gain access to quality essential services. I really wanted to tell the story about the problems that people face and how they crush them, what they do to navigate them. And I wanted to shine the light on the institutional constraints they face. And so the moment that crisis emerged, I all of a sudden had an outcome variable. Before that, the IRB that was approved was really to look at public safety deficits in the community and how people are confronting those. And so that IRB, which was approved somewhere between 2011, 2012, a few years before the crisis began, was called When the Cops Stop Knocking. And that was approved at the university that I taught at before coming to Florida State University. And so again, my eye has always been on Flint. And the moment I had the opportunity to jump on this to do the work to understand what folks are going through, um, I followed my nose and I followed my heart and I did just that.
Yeah, and so folks, if you're not familiar with IRB, that's Institutional Research Board. Just so anytime you do a study that involves human subjects at a research institute, it goes through a really rigorous process where it's vetted and make sure that you're not putting folks at risk. And so that's what Katrinell is referring to. But this is a great segue to talk about your book and all the different kinds of data. So part of it is you're shining light and you're giving voice to people in the community. But I know from working with you that you also had all these health data. You had a mass of so much data, and it was such a uphill battle. Tell us about your book. Tell us about some of that data that you marshaled to tell the story.
And so I am very used to people sort of saying, well, that's a bad, you know, we feel bad that those people are going through that, but do we really know that that's happening? And what did they cause? What part of this tragedy did they play a role in? My role in this particular study was really about um, going well beyond that narrative, right? To sort of, we were always centering individual factors, individual choice, people's bad decisions and things of this nature, but we're not always looking at what institutions do to sort of set them up for the circumstances that they actually confront. And so my job, knowing the environmental justice literature, was to really do the work to help the people make their case, right? Oftentimes, communities struggle with being able to demonstrate that they actually have a pollution problem. There are so many mechanisms that are used to undermine their realistic appraisal of their circumstances, right? And so my job as a scholar was to really make an effort to sort of say, okay, these problems emerged and they're concentrated here, and here's what here's what happened as a result of that. I wanted to make a connection between what actually happens, or the problem, and then what happens after this problem is reported, and sort of shine a light on the back and forth, because the back and forth of it all. And what am I referring to when I say the back and forth? The what people have to go through to see a problem through, or see it to get a resolution, it's a lot. And in our culture, we have this assumption that problems disappear the moment they we're not able to view the issue on the television screen. But in poor, depopulated areas like Flint, problems sort of stay there. And so I really wanted to capture what was happening in Flint, and make sure that it was properly situated in that, because I remember when just giving a talk on Flint, people say, well, did the problem with the water begin when folks, because, or is it related to self-governance, right? Are folks in Flint, or did they deal with water problems because essentially the local people didn't know how to handle their business? Okay, I've heard that several times. And what's unique about the situation in Flint was that Flint was, or the local leaders weren't in control at all. The state was in control of the purse strings in Flint. And so my job in this piece was to really get the data, right? And then just make it plain. That's my job, top to bottom. And so I began by just simply just trying to get my hands on the complaints. My first, the very first thing that I did before I attempted to get my hands on complaints, I flew out to Flint as soon as the semester was over in 2015, uh, May 2015. Did a few interviews with city leaders, people who were in the news, um, talking about Flint, talking about the water, being concerned about the issues that motivated not just their concerns with the water, but also their concerns about the affordability of the water.
Bit of a tech.
I'm sorry, I don't, huh?
Oh, there was we had a bit of a instability. Of course, the thunderstorms are rolling in. So sorry, folks. But yeah, so keep going on. You were telling us about you went into town. You started with some interviews with some local city leaders.
Yeah, I started with interviews of local city leaders. And keep in mind, I had been studying Flint since 2011. And so everything that was dropped online via the emergency manager, because they regularly posted updates, et cetera, about the city, I processed. I've been reading area studies on Flint. I've been trying to look at how should we sort of study this particular city, because what we tend to see are studies that sort of say, okay, this place is depopulated, so here are the things that we can do to help people be okay with where they are. That's a nice conversation, but I really want to know, as a person who grew up poor, I want to know how people are pushing through, because we fundamentally misunderstand the circumstances. So when I showed up in Flint, May of 2015, I showed up with the purpose of knowing or learning from people who are experiencing the issues with water affordability, water quality. I went out there to sort of see what they were. I completely lost my train of thought, but I'll continue to go. So when I went out in May 2015 to Flint, and this is right after the end of a semester, I had the mission of essentially figuring out what was happening on the ground, and really to understand from the perspective of leaders, people who were in the news. And at this point, there were some stories about Flint, small stories nonetheless, but they existed. So I wanted to talk to those people who were in the news, people who were taking the lead in these town meetings about the concerns, and figure out uh, how things sort of looked in Flint, and how these problems manifested. I wanted to learn about the different hurdles that they came in contact with. For instance, I remember speaking with a resident who consistently, made concerns or voiced complaints with the water. And she mentioned that despite those complaints, there wasn't much traction that she could, or she wasn't able to, compel the water department to come out to test her water, and mentioned that it would be 4 to 6 weeks before anyone would come out. She mentioned that she complained to several different agencies and offices within the city, outside of the city. And so just hearing those sort of things, as a scholar, you begin to sort of say, okay, how much of this is true? How much of this is frustration? And what does the state have to say, about any of this? What's the state's role in this? Because ultimately, when we do research, our information, we have to corroborate what we learn. We call it triangulation. We come up with these cool terms to simply say, we just can't say stuff without making sure that it's vetted and valid, right? And so when I went out to interview in Flint, Again, the purpose was to simply figure out how this problem manifested on the ground, and to and so then when I went home, it was really to figure out what I needed to do to either corroborate what was said, or sort of provide more detail about the circumstances. And the first thing that I encountered was pushback. I encountered it from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, because I immediately became concerned about how the lead trends were reported. They were grouping zip codes in Flint. Now, as a Flint resident, or former Flint resident, and really in 2011, I actually still owned a home in Flint. But anyway, I digress. I knew that they were grouping areas that were very dissimilar. And I had concerns that they weren't really reporting the data as it landed. I had deep concerns. I was so concerned I got on the phone. I said, "What's going on with this? I'd really love to know what's your reporting protocol, etc." And then I found out essentially, look, I'm going to need to get my hands on this data and see what's happening myself. That said, I had no history of requesting said data. So I had to contact friends, I had to do my own research, and I had to really do what was necessary to be able to make the case in my own heart and mind, as well as on paper, that I needed that data. And now, and so at the University of Vermont, I didn't have a problem with the IRB process, that process that you just explained that gives us permission to get the data. But the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services put up several roadblocks, created processes, etc. And it essentially took somewhere between 15 to 18 months for me to get that data, despite the fact that the protocol or the request to study the data was pretty solid. There was a waiting game. And so I took that data with my interview data, and I said, okay, I feel like I know what's going on, but I want to supplement this material with more voices in Flint. Because again, I grew up Flint, or yeah, I grew up Flint, right? But I grew up poor in Flint. And I know that there's a thing where people show up and then they leave. And sometimes when reporters or policymakers, when they want to know what's happening in Flint, they ask the same people who make themselves available. And again, people tend to not get much out of those exchanges. I didn't want to participate in that game. And so I was aware that Flint residents regularly share their concerns with city services at city council meetings. And so I then transcribed, downloaded and transcribed a good 10 years of city council meetings to get a good take on what people in Flint were thinking about, what problems motivated them, and what they were asking their local leaders to do about them, right? And so that data is what I use to supplement the data that I received, or the interviews that I did with city leaders and a few residents. And then lastly, and actually this isn't it, but I'll just say this last piece of data that I collected. I collected data that helps us sort of get at or really measure the impact of uneven development and infrastructural neglect. I'll say that again. What I attempted to do by getting brownfield site data, and brownfield site data essentially is a marker of contamination in the area. It's usually the mark of, or what happens when you have gas stations close up and leave, but they close shop, but they leave um, their gasoline storage tanks, right? In many cases, those tanks have cracks. They flood the soil and they become a problem. In places like Flint, we don't do much with brownfield sites, right? Um, Brownfield sites are usually remediated only when that property is desirable. Otherwise, we leave that stuff alone. And so, what are the impacts of brownfield sites, existing uh, 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 infrastructure neglect, community neglect? How is that shaping this process that's already bad, right? You know, people are impacted by the decisions made by the state to change the water source, right? But we also know that the impact of this problem is not the same throughout the community. And so there's a question, why is that the case? Is it simply, luck of the draw? Or does it have something else? Are there other factors at play? In my book, I make the case that the other factors that matter are infrastructure neglect, uh, uh, and the you know the legacy of this neglect. Essentially, as I mentioned, the brownfield sites, the water main breaks that never get fixed, right? And so I wanted to pair that information with the blood lead data to sort of see if there was a connection between um, that information or those manifestations of neglect and the more extreme cases of lead contamination. And there were. Uh, and I said that was the last thing, but here's the last thing. I pulled the pipeline replacement data because that's part of the story. What we don't know is that after the state of Michigan's, issued its apology for messing up the water system in Flint, it had to be compelled to fix the water system by who? Flint residents, right? And this lawsuit was concluded in 2017. But yeah, the state of Michigan went through well, here's what I want to say. It drug its feet. And so what I wanted to do to sort of see what its priorities were when it approached this pipeline replacement process. In the state of Michigan could say, well, the city and the Department of Environmental Quality was in control of picking the sites that would be selected for this pipeline replacement process. But I wanted to see with my own eyes, through a statistical analysis, what the realities or what the pushers actually were during the first 4 phases of the process, the first two or so years of the process. And so, yeah, I think it's important to note that Flint is still not fixed. When I talk about this book, I want to be clear, very clear in expressing that specific point. Flint is not fixed. There are issues, irregularities that I noticed in its pipeline replacement process. And if you just think of this notion that a city or a state would say that a water system is clean when it's forced to dig up and replace the service lines in a third of the parcels in the city. You kind of have to doubt that, right? And so it's important again to note that there are over 55,000 parcels in the city of Flint. The state was compelled to address just over 20,000, and I think that there's a claim that they did a little bit more. But there are so many things that were problematic in that process, and so my job in my study was to really point those things out, because I personally don't live in Flint. You know, I still have people that I love who live in Flint, right? But I don't live in Flint. My capacity to show up and, you know, and have water tested and link up with other people and continue this thing. That's not the role that I can play because I'm here in Tallahassee, Florida. But with the talents that I have, I've tried to tell the story in a coherent way in Tainted Tap that enables the audience to understand that, again, Flint is not fixed, and understand why Flint isn't fixed, right? There was systemic injustice that occurred in that space over time, and it wasn't corrected after the national spot was shown on Flint, or after the governor issued an apology. It wasn't even corrected after the city of Flint or its residents sued to get those lines replaced. So people are steady in a space of trying to force the state to be transparent in its efforts, force the city to be transparent in its efforts now that it's in control of its operations again. And from my perspective, it's an uphill battle. It's been an uphill battle. It may continue to be, but I'm hoping that people like myself, social justice scholars, and people that are like-minded continue to do the work to make sure that the issues in spaces like this are exposed for all to see, and that this information that we produce is generated in such a way where it's verifiable and easy to consume, and something that residents themselves can go and get their hands on. I like dropping breadcrumbs. I'm all about people coming behind me and doing the work in another area, continuing the work, etc. And so that's what Tainted Tap was all about. It's Flint's testimony, or its story, in struggle with uneven development and consistent neglect. And I wanted to be clear in Tainted Tap that this crisis is not an event. It's not something that just happened. It's a process. You know, it was an outcome that was, you know, bound to happen at some point. And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple points worth underscoring. First, just the difficulty of social science research, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Oftentimes folks just don't really understand what are social sciences. But for the problems that you're saying, it's complicated. And to really understand and do the kind of study that you did, you have to come at it from so many different angles. It's about making such different data speak directly to each other, right? Finding the points where the story of a resident, right, and the health data and the city council data, where those all come together, where you can see, yes, I do understand what's happening here. It's also, I mean, and this gets to your podcast. So you have a couple, last I checked, there were 2 episodes of your podcast, Tainted Tap, out, which is really about this point of implementation. I mean, as you noted, we tend to think of, oh, there was a court case and they won, or the state said that they're fixing it and that's it. And there's always that issue of implementation. If no one's looking, then there's not incentive to actually move quickly and to fix problems. And so tell us a little bit about the podcast. Is that what I know you say the podcast is about keeping this Flint on the radar. Is it about this transparency piece that you mentioned, or is there more?
Absolutely, absolutely. The podcast is an opportunity to bring attention to the book on some level, and so it's a very limited series, or it was sort of thought of as a limited series when I agreed to do this, and so it's very much about what's happening in Flint now. It gets at what was happening in Flint before the crisis happened. As I mentioned, it's looking at what's happening in that city now. But it's what I love about this podcast is that it covers people's perspective on what's needed to move Flint and cities like it forward, despite the roadblocks and misdeeds that have really tripped people up. And so I've been really amazed by this experience, really and truly. I'm not a social media person. I'm not a podcast consumer. I don't post my food. All of these things. And so I was really brought to this thing kicking and screaming because I'm not that public. That said, I was able to be convinced because I really put my heart and soul into this particular project. And although I haven't had the experience of telling people, okay, I wrote this, I was going to try it this time. And I think I needed this experience. I actually do. I think it woke me up. I've had an opportunity to speak with brilliant people who have varied perspectives about this city, and I've learned a lot. The first thing I've learned is that these people are incredibly resilient, and I like that this podcast gives people an opportunity to see that or to hear that resilience. I like that I was able to gain another appreciation or a greater appreciation for the work that I did, because I'm hearing it's cool hearing different things that I wrote about or engaged in the book, sort of talked about by residents, and realizing that these other issues like the brownfield sites that I brought up and the water main breaks that I wrote about are on other people's minds. What are the impact of those things? And why aren't we talking about those things? Why are we trying to limit the conversation? And so this opportunity has motivated me to continue forward as a social justice scholar. And it's reminded me what I wrote about. And sometimes you write books and you totally forget. I submitted this book this version of the book December 2019, okay? And it came out May 3rd, 2021, okay? And so I was really in a space like, people won't care about anything that I have to say. It's gonna be completely outdated. And I was bummed out completely. Truly, this is real talk, real testimony. But if you listen to the podcast, I came up, or I have a religious upbringing, and so long story short, I don't believe in coincidences, and so I do think that the book came out at a time where it could be consumed. We're currently talking about infrastructure investments in this country, and Flint, other cities like it. It's had an experience like this, like Washington, D.C. We need to talk about these spaces, right? And so this podcast puts us there, right? Because our focus has been on, okay, these cities can't take care of themselves. Their tax problems, we're having all types of issues keeping people in these spaces. Most of the people who are here are poor. We hear all of these descriptive explanations for consistent issues in these poverty or working class communities, right? But we don't hear a lot about the bureaucratic obstruction, the arbitrary decisions that shape where people end up. And these decisions also shape whether or not we choose to do anything about known poverty or pollution issues. And so I really appreciate the opportunity in this podcast to talk to different people. I've spoken with residents, uh, um, Chia Morgan, Melissa Mays, uh, elected leaders, uh, Congresswoman or Councilwoman, rather. I said I gave her a promotion, but Councilwoman Monica Galloway, former Mayor Dane Walling, uh, other people in the community, Brian Larkin. Um, I spoke to academics. Um, I'm blanking on my brother's name. Now I'm not. Ben Pauley. And I spoke with folks who played a role in making sure that other people in the world knew about Flint, like Daryl Dalsey, who was with the ACLU of Michigan that broke the story. And so my goal with this podcast is I'm going to allow myself to do another round of interviews, right? Initially, I was so scared to do this, but like I mentioned, this process, this experience, it woke me up, and it reminded me that people are still fighting for Flint. And the other thing that I like about this podcast, I'm as I listen to the episodes, I'm reminded that other people, other cities are going through the same thing. And the sad thing is that they don't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the points you made. Katrinell did a policy pub that you can look up that's available on the College of Social Sciences website, where she makes the point you just said. It's other cities. So Flint, we think of Flint as this isolated incident, but in your policy pub, you talked about, well, it could be Tallahassee could be the next Flint. There's all these cities that have poor infrastructure and have suffered years of abuse, that certainly you could have these kinds of water crises. And this is definitely the moment to be talking about it. So how many episodes do you think you'll have for your podcast? Have you decided?
Well, I've taped 8, and we're currently, I dropped 5 today, episode 5 today with Monica Galloway. The plan is to do a few more, because I'd love to have conversations with people in the community and outside of the community that work on issues specific to the community, so that we are clear that people are busy at work trying to address their own problems, and there are no victims in Flint.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. And once again, I'm speaking with Dr. Katrinell Davis. Her new book, Tainted Tap, which was published on Monday, May 3rd with UNC Press, is available. You can go to their website, or you can also go to Amazon, go to wherever you like to buy your books, and you can hear her podcast by the same name, Tainted Tap, wherever you would like to hear your podcast. So thank you, Katrinell. And
Thank you.
Congratulations on your wonderful book and the great podcast. I look forward to listening to the rest of the series.
Thanks again for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.